All right, guys, welcome. We are going to get into Unit 8, the emergence of the third world. I don't know if I'll be able to get this all done in one shot or not. Just put my son down for a nap, but let's see how far we can get. So if you remember earlier in the course, we talked about empire in different contexts and specifically the European empires that conquered all of Africa, much of Asia. And what you can see on this map here is in a very, very short window of time, starting right at the end of World War II for the next 20 years or so, 25 years. All of the countries that are numbered and colored in on this map gained independence from mostly the British and the French empires, but there were others that you can see coded there. So the third world, it's often a term used as a shorthand for poor developing countries. And there's some truth to that. But in the context of the Cold War, there's two worlds. There's two alliances. There's the capitalist countries and there are the communist countries. And then all of a sudden, there's this third element, the third world, which is all of these dozens of newly independent countries. And one of the questions in the context of the Cold War is which side they would be on. So that's where that term comes from. So this is an era of nationalism and the collapse of the European empires. After World War II, why did it happen when it did? The collapse of the empires. Most European nations lacked the ability, the economic ability, the military ability, the political will necessary to maintain their empires. Here you can see the British and the French empires. And though the British and the French empires were technically on the winning side of World War II, they were bankrupt. Their militaries were depleted. Their home countries were bombed severely. And their voters had no will to continue to spend money and to send their people to control all these huge empires, right? The will was gone, the economic ability to do it was gone. So at the close of World War II, it's not a coincidence that these empires collapse at that point because everybody's exhausted. Even the sides that, quote, won the war are physically and economically just drained of the will to do this. Now, one of the questions that these newly independent countries had to decide early on was, do we keep the borders as drawn by the European empires? We covered this in an earlier unit, that a lot of the borders in the Middle East and Africa, for example, were drawn by European empires. They were artificially drawn for purposes of divide and conquer. So hopefully you remember that. These were intentionally unstable places that grouped together several different people that didn't get along. And so one of the first things they had to decide when they got independence was, do we keep these borders even though they're artificial and unstable, or do we change the borders? And out of the many countries that had to make this decision, one example is Syria. And you can see with the color coding on this map, you don't need to get too much into the weeds, but just all of the colors on this map represent distinct groups of people who don't really get along. And if you know anything about Syria, it's an incredibly complex country with all kinds of different groups. And they were in a civil war, still are, depending on who you ask, for 15 years. And that is a result of the instability of these borders. And so with Syria, we can see an example of why keeping these borders guarantees instability and civil war. But the alternative would be changing the borders. And that also, when that was done, led to some problems, to say the least. So the biggest example of that would be India, British India. So one option is keeping the borders that the Europeans drew while understanding the risk of that and the chaos. The other option is changing the borders. And how'd that work out? Well, let's look at India. India decided to do what Syria and most other countries didn't. They decided to change their borders and divide the nation into smaller pieces based on the fact that there are different groups of people that don't really want to share a country, so let's subdivide the country. Makes sense on paper. So India divided into smaller pieces based on religion, language, or ethnicity, and India specifically was mostly about religion. India is an incredibly diverse place, and British India included huge numbers of Muslims and Hindus and everybody else you can imagine. And so, what India decided to do was to divide British India into two and then three and then four countries. Basically, some territory would be set aside for Muslims and some territory would be set aside for Hindus. And here's what happened. And this is a little bit blurry, but in the middle, in that kind of purple color, is the core of India, which kept the name India. But the green areas that you see here, which were all part of British India, now separated and seceded and became independent countries. Pakistan, it was called West Pakistan at the time, and East Pakistan is now called Bangladesh. So basically, the Muslims in India decided that they did not want to live in a Hindu majority country. So they carved out their own countries, Pakistan and Bangladesh, and those were to be Muslim majority areas. In the core of India, in light purple here, was to remain a Hindu majority country. Now, Hindus and Muslims have been living together throughout all of India for centuries, and there was some conflict, of course, but it got a lot worse actually when they separated. What you see on the map here in the arrows, the green arrows represent migration of Muslims who lived in the core of India. And now that India was going to be a Hindu majority country, and there were going to be new countries set aside for Muslims, those green arrows represent Muslims who migrated from India into Pakistan or Bangladesh. The red arrows represent Hindus who lived in areas of India, which now all of a sudden were not going to be part of India. They were going to be set aside as Pakistan or Bangladesh. So those red areas represent Hindus who all of a sudden are informed that they're going to live in a Muslim majority country. So a lot of them felt like they'd be more secure migrating into the center of India, where their people, the Hindus, would be the majority group. So both the red and green arrows, remember, we're talking a billion people in India. So those red and green arrows represent millions and millions of people. Hindus leaving the green areas, Muslims leaving the purple areas. And as these huge flows of refugees and migrants are passing each other, violence breaks out and hundreds of thousands of people were killed. And what was one country is now three. And India and Pakistan, which used to be two parts of one country, are now mortal enemies. They have fought several wars over the last 70 years, and they both have nuclear weapons aimed at each other. So India was an example of how it might make sense on paper to change the borders that the Europeans drew, but it led to mass violence, civil war, and one country becoming, three countries that are almost always at war with each other. So the lesson to other countries, such as Syria, was as bad as these borders are and as unstable as our country is because of the borders, if we try to change the borders like India did, that could be even worse. So a lot of people looked at what happened to India and decided by, noticing the tragedy that happened in India, they decided, you know what, as bad as these borders are, we don't want what happened to India to happen to us. So most of those borders throughout the Middle East and Africa were kept, and they remain to this day. There was also an ideology called Pan-Arabism, which was viewed as a threat by the United States government. And the idea behind this, what pan meaning across, and Arabism having to do with the Arab world. The Arabs are a specific ethnic group. They have their own language. They are overwhelmingly Muslim. They have a lot that connects them. And all of the countries in yellow here, with the exception of Sudan and Somalia, I don't know why those colored in, all the countries in yellow are Arab countries. They speak the same language, they share the same religion, same culture, same geography, et cetera, et cetera. And so Pan-Arabism said, rather than have 22 Arab countries, let's erase these borders, the borders between Egypt and Libya, for example, which again, look at it, straight line, suspicious, artificial. Let's erase all these borders and have one huge Arab nation. Now, the US opposed that idea because it was viewed as a threat. That would be, I'll show you the data in a minute. The US feared that one huge Arab nation would be a big, rich, powerful nation that could threaten some of the interests of the United States. And so from the point of view of the United States, it was better to have the Arab world divided and to have rivalries in there for purposes of divide and conquer. Now, what might surprise you is even some Arab nations opposed Pan-Arabism. So let's look at why that would be. As you know, in this part of the world, there's a lot of oil, but it's not spread out equally. So let's look at, so the darker the green, the more oil there is. Now, Iran is not an Arab country. Iran is Persian. So let's separate out Iran, but let's look at Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Egypt, for example. Saudi Arabia has a huge amount of oil, as you probably know. Egypt is right next to it. Egypt has comparatively almost no oil compared to Saudi Arabia. Okay? So let's follow this. Egypt and Saudi Arabia, the two most influential Arab countries probably in the world. And they might say publicly, we're all brothers, we would love to unite and have one big country. Okay. In reality, though, let's think about this. Saudi Arabia has relatively few people, but a ton of oil. Egypt has a lot of people, but almost no oil. Saudi Arabia is very wealthy. Egypt is very poor. What would happen to Saudi Arabia if it united with Egypt, let's say? Just that one country, not all 22 Arab countries uniting, just this one example. If Egypt and Saudi Arabia united, Saudi Arabia would be considerably less rich than it is right now. You understand? Because now it would be sharing. Egypt has a lot more people and a lot less money. So if they incorporate together, that means in order to spread out the wealth throughout the single economy now, a lot of money is going to be transferred out of Saudi into Egypt. And so a lot of Arab states would have actually, from their point of view, had a reason not to unite with other Arab countries. Specifically, oil-rich countries don't want to unite with oil-poor countries. So there are a lot of reasons Pan-Arabism didn't work. The United States didn't want it, but also a lot of Arab countries didn't want it because they can say whatever they want, but deep down, do they really want to share their oil wealth with relatively poorer neighboring countries? And the answer was in a lot of cases, no, they didn't. Now, if this had worked, if all those Arab countries had united, what would it look like? They'd have 400 million people. That would be the third highest population in the world, behind only China and India. They'd have a huge economy. Their economy overall, because of the oil wealth, would be the sixth biggest in the world. Because as much oil wealth as they don't really have much else going on. So it would be the sixth biggest economy in the world. Now look at the difference though between the total economy and the GDP, gross domestic product. Overall, it would have, you know, a $3+ trillion economy, sixth highest in the world. But GDP per person, look at this, it would be the 95th richest country in the world per person. And that's what matters, right? Per person. If you guys are young, I assume you're single and don't have kids. If you have $1 million and I have $1 million and you're single with no kids, you're 5 times as rich as I am because I'm not single with no kids. I have a family of 5. And so if all of Arabia, let's say, were one huge country, they'd have a ton of money, but they have so many people that per person, they wouldn't really be that rich. Their per person would be $8,000 a year, as you can see there. They would be poorer than Paraguay. They'd be right in the middle of the global economy. But overall, they'd be very rich, just not per person. In land size, it'd be the second biggest country in the world, behind only Russia. And it would control really important shipping lanes. It would control the Suez Canal. It would control the Red Sea. It would control the entire coast of the Mediterranean. It would be a very powerful nation. But it didn't happen. There were 2 very brief, low-scale attempts at this. And one of them was in the 50s, Egypt and Syria united. This lasted like barely a year and a half. But that caused some problems. One of the problems that you can see just practically is they're not contiguous. They don't connect. They're separated by Israel. It's hard to have a country with 2 parts that aren't connected. It happens sometimes, but it's not easy. And the other thing is, both these countries at the time were led by dictators. And they could say that they wanted to unite and they're all brothers, but their egos wouldn't really allow one or the other to take control. So it just didn't work politically, economically, geographically. The other attempt in 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And he argued at the time that Kuwait was an artificial country created by the British, fact check true, that previous to Kuwait being created, it was part of Iraq, fact check true. And Saddam Hussein said, therefore, he was justified in erasing that, illegitimate artificial border. And he did it, and he got away with it for about 6 months until the United States and many, many other countries went to war to undo this, to reverse this, because the fear was Iraq and Kuwait are both very oil rich, and that would give Saddam Hussein, who is a brutal dictator, too much control of the world's oil market. And so those are the exceptions to the rule. The rule is, sorry, I don't mean to be rude. Just my wife is texting me to make sure everything's okay. All right, sorry about that. The rule is this doesn't work. Erasing these borders and uniting countries together. It sounds great on paper. In actuality, it doesn't work for several different reasons. Another example of this idea of erasing all these old European borders is Pan-Africanism. Same idea as Pan-Arabism, but just in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa specifically. Now, this really didn't work. And the reasons behind that are, number one, in the Arab worlds, they share language, religion, ethnicity, geography. Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is far more diverse. There's so many different languages. There's so many different tribal affiliations and religions. There's really not that much that connects them. So this really never got off the ground as an idea. And the other thing you should keep in mind, if you go back to, let me go back to this map right here. Keep in mind, Africa, the northern third of the continent is ethnically Arab and religiously Muslim. Sub-Saharan Africa is not ethnically Arab, right? There's all kinds of ethnicities, but they're black, they're not Arab. And the most common religion is Christianity, not Islam. So even when they're talking about Pan-Africanism, they don't mean the whole continent. It probably just would have been sub-Saharan Africa, but even that part of Africa is way too diverse for this to have worked. Another nation that was created during this period was the modern state of Israel after the Holocaust. The idea was pretty obvious, I think, after that scale of a crime, the victims deserved their own country. The Jews didn't have their own country, and that's one reason they were so vulnerable, is that when they were persecuted anywhere they were in the world, there's nowhere for them to go where they're safe. And so the idea behind the state of Israel was the people that were just subjected to this catastrophe, to the Holocaust, they need their own country. Why? Because when you have your own country, you have your own army. And if you have your own army, you can at least defend yourself if people try to murder all of you. And if you have your own country, Jews throughout the world, if they start being persecuted in Europe or in anywhere else, they have a safe place to run to, where they'll be protected, where their own people are, and where they have an army. Now, immediately after Israel declared independence, it was invaded by every Arab nation that bordered it. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Saudi Arabia jumped in. And this was the first of a long line of wars of the Arab states trying to wipe Israel off the map. Now, this is a very controversial, divisive issue, as I'm sure a lot of you know. And I want to try to present to you the two different perspectives here. Israel is a David and Goliath story. And that's fitting because, you know, David, as in King David, the Star of David, which is the flag of Israel. It's fitting that it's a David and Goliath story because it's from the Old Testament. The question is, who's David and who's Goliath? So in the David and Goliath story, as I'm sure you know, Goliath is kind of this metaphor for this big, powerful, seemingly unstoppable force. And David is the underdog who seems like he can't possibly win, but he miraculously wins and defeats this far superior force in Goliath. The question is, who is David? Who is the small, vulnerable underdog? And who's Goliath? And it's in the eye of the beholder. The image on the left shows the process. It's a little oversimplified, but for the purposes of this, let's just take this at face value. The image on the left shows the Palestinian people in green. Those are the Arab, mostly Muslim inhabitants of that area. And it shows in the white areas are areas controlled by the Israelis, who are overwhelmingly Jewish. And over time, the trend is pretty clear that the Palestinians did lose significant territory to the Israelis. No one denies that. Now, the image on the left, though, so if you look at the image on the left and take it at face value, who's the Goliath? Well, the white, right? The Israelis. And who's the David? Who's this small, overwhelmed force that seems like they're being dominated by this huge, aggressive monster? Well, the image on the left, you would say, well, the green group, whoever that is, it's the Palestinians. They're the underdog, right? Look how much land they've lost. There's a lot of truth to that, but it's all perspective, because if you look at that part of the world and you zoom out a little bit, so we're looking at the image on the left where they show this process of the Palestinians losing this land. And it looks like Israel's this big, aggressive, dominant force. If you zoom out to the whole Middle East, to the whole Arab Muslim neighborhood, that's the image on the right, you can barely see Israel. See it right in the middle, that teeny, teeny green sliver? Who's the Goliath now? You see, it's all about perspective. A lot of people say Israel is an expansionist, aggressive force that's displacing huge numbers of people. Or you could zoom out and say Israel is a teeny, 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 teeny sliver of land surrounded by people that have 1,000 times as much land, but they're obsessed with destroying this tiny group of people. So who's the David, who's the Goliath? It depends on your point of view, as so often in life. In 1955, Indonesia, which is one of the newly independent countries, hosted a conference in Bandung, Indonesia, for newly independent countries that want to remain neutral in the Cold War. They don't want anything to do with either side. They want to be independent and do their own thing. But the United States government was very suspicious of that. And the United States government said neutral is basically a code word for communist. So it was either you're with us or you're with the communists. Now, another thing that was very common during this period, and still is you need to think about who should we be allies with in terms of foreign leaders? Who should we support? Who should we give money and guns to? One example of many, US-backed General Joseph Mobutu in Zaire, which is now Congo, in Central Africa, military dictator, pretty brutal guy, established a centralized and extraordinary violent government. And he was one of the West's, the United States, most important Cold War allies in Africa, even though he was a murderous dictator. He was one of our allies. And this happened all throughout the world, and it still does. And the question is, who should we be supportive of when it comes to foreign countries? And there's two ways to look at it. One way is we should have nothing to do with dictators who murder people because we're better than that, right? That's fine. The other point of view is pretty Machiavellian. Like, look, it's a dangerous world. There's a lot of bad guys out there. There's no angels out there. And we need to be realistic. And this quote sums up the policy of the United States. How can you support someone like Mobutu, for example? Well, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch, right? So this is the approach. Yeah, we know he's a bad guy. The world is full of bad guys, but he's our bad guy. He's on our side, so we don't care. And you should think about the morality of that in your opinion. Now, in terms of the economic situation in these countries. Now, after independence, it's very romantic, optimistic feeling that things are going to be great. And unfortunately, that didn't really happen in a lot of these places. They remain pretty poor. And the conventional wisdom is it remains broadly true that poverty and underdevelopment feed the fires of civil unrest. In other words, poverty causes violence and crime and chaos, right? And that most people are like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And you could absolutely say that that's true. You could say that it's obvious. But just to think critically, of course, ask yourself, is it that simple? Does poverty cause crime? Or it's a chicken and the egg thing, which comes first, right? Does crime cause poverty? The idea that poverty causes crime seems very straightforward and obvious to most people. Poor people are desperate and they're likely to commit crimes out of desperation. Sure. Now, the crime causes poverty argument says, well, let me give you an example. In the United States, let's say there is a city with a lot of crime. And let's say the local government of that city says, we will not prosecute shoplifters. There are several cities in the United States that don't prosecute shoplifters. If someone steals less than $1,000, we're not going to arrest them. Okay. What's going to happen to the stores in those cities? Well, eventually they're going to go out of business. Because if a government allows people to walk into a business and steal without consequence, the business will fail. The business is paying for the products that people are then stealing, and eventually the business will go out of business. And so imagine a city in which a bunch of businesses are closing down due to crime. What's going to happen to all the people that work at those businesses? Well, they're going to lose their job. And what's going to happen to that city in general? There's going to be more poverty because there's less jobs. And what, in this scenario, what caused that poverty? Crime. So it's just a thought exercise, right? It's not an either or. It's could there be both of these things going on? And so in the big picture context of a lot of these third world countries that are so poor. Well, there's not a lot of investments in a lot of these places because they are violent and unstable. And you're not going to invest in, for example, building uh, a big hotel or a big infrastructure project in a country that has civil war, for example. So it's just six and a half a dozen. It's just something for you to think through critically and decide what makes most sense to you. During the 1970s, prices for agricultural exports collapsed. States' reliance on cash crops. So here's another problem that a lot of these countries had. When the empires controlled them, they shaped the economy for their own interests. And one thing they pushed was cash crops. Uh, Cotton, for example, that's a cash crop. It's valuable, but you can't eat it. And so a country that relies on cash crops like coffee or cotton, let's say, that's great if the market is good and they can sell their cotton, for example, and get enough money to buy enough food. But if the market for cotton, for example, drops, that's a catastrophe because what are they going to do with the cotton? They can't eat it. They have to sell it. But if they're not making enough money and all they've been growing is this cash crop, what are they going to eat? So a lot of these places before the Europeans took them over were self-sufficient because the farmers there grew a variety of crops. They would grow some cash crops. They might grow cotton, for example, but they would also grow grains and vegetables and fruits, so they could eat. But when the empires came in and said, "Hey, we're clearing all this land for cotton," for example, well, that's great as long as the price of cotton is high. And when it's not, you have countries that should be able to feed themselves that have all this cotton that they can't sell, or that they are selling but not making enough money to go out and buy food. So this was devastating, right? And it's an after effect. It's an example of even after the imperialism ends, the system and the after effects of it are not truly gone. Industrial projects in the third world countries required foreign technology, expertise, loans, and that led to debt. A lot of these countries borrowed huge amounts of money from Americans and Europeans mostly, and then their economies were in serious trouble because they borrowed more than they could pay back. And in the early 2000s, you can see here a couple examples from Africa. You see their debt building up and then it drops off a cliff in the early 2000s. That's not because they paid off all their debt. That's because the debt was forgiven. It was wiped off and the lenders said, you don't need to pay back. And so the question there is, when is that justified? Because look, everybody would like to have debt relief. I would love it if my bank called me and said, "Hey, you know what? You don't need to finish paying off your mortgage. It's been forgiven." That would be fantastic. I could retire. But we need to live in a world where people pay their debts, so or else no one's going to lend anybody any money ever again, right? So when is it justified? And here was the case that a lot of these African countries made. Well, I was talking about Mobutu from Zaire a couple slides ago, and his country isn't listed here, but it's in Africa, it's near these other countries, and it's a very similar thing going on. So here's the idea of debt relief being justified. These countries were mostly controlled by dictators. When dictators borrow money, what do they tend to do? They tend not to build schools and hospitals and bridges. They tend to build palaces for themselves, and they tend to pay off their generals and whoever else they need to keep the dictatorship in power. They tend to use the money they borrow to buy all of their generals brand new BMWs so that they won't turn their back on the dictator and overthrow him. Right? They tend not to invest in their people. They tend to invest in their generals to keep them in power. right? So here's the theory of debt forgiveness. If a military dictatorship in Mozambique borrowed a bunch of money in 1980 and spent all the money on, buying palaces for the generals in the military dictatorship and spent none of the money on their own people. Why would you ask a young person in Mozambique, someone your age today, who wasn't even alive when that money was borrowed? So number one, the money was never used to invest in the people, to improve the economy. And number two, most of the people alive in Mozambique today weren't even alive when the money was borrowed. So since they're not responsible for having borrowed it, number one, and number two, it was never used for its intended purpose. How can you ask someone in a poor country now who had nothing to do with the decision to be responsible for working their whole life to pay off debt that didn't help them, from 50 years ago? Why not just forgive the debt, wipe it off? So now young people now in those poor countries can work to build up their countries rather than to pay uh, on money that was borrowed before they were alive and that didn't benefit their grandparents. That's the theory. Okay, so you should think about, when is that justified? The term, jump ahead for 1 second to say, okay, this term neocolonialism came into play as a theory to explain why these newly independent countries were still so poor and chaotic. And this cartoon is pretty on the nose. It says, the old school system of imperialism was in your face, physically hands-on enslavement. Guy with a gun shows up and puts chains on you. You all know what that is. And what this thesis says is that now that these countries are independent, they're only independent on paper. In reality, it looks a little different, but the system is still fundamentally the same. The West is still controlling these countries, not physically, literally with chains and guns, but indirectly and economically with debt. Right. And so whoever made this cartoon, for example, would surely be in favor of debt forgiveness that we just talked about. Now, the counterclaim to this thesis is it's a catch-22. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. So here's the counterclaim. The Europeans conquered Africa, for example, but then they left and Africa became independent. And then the Europeans lent huge amounts of money to those African countries. And now neocolonialists are blaming the Europeans for lending Africa a bunch of money. And the catch-22 is the neocolonialists are blaming the Europeans for lending money to Africa. You know what they would also blame the Europeans for? If they hadn't lent money to Africa. You see what I'm saying? If they hadn't lent the money to Africa, the Europeans would be looked at as the bad guys. How dare you not lend these people money? They need to help to rebuild their country. So the Europeans did lend them the money, and the neocolonialists condemned them for that too. So they would have been condemned either way. But just something for you to think through the logic of that, if that makes sense to you. 1970s, the continent, as Africa, descended into political chaos and economic catastrophe. And there were plenty of doomsayers waiting in the wings to point out how good, quote, colonial rule had actually been. So after independence, the economy, well, look at the blue line here. This is sub-Saharan Africa as a whole. So this would include about 30 countries. During the 70s, all the way to the mid 80s, their economies were collapsing. At this point, these are fully independent countries. The Europeans are nowhere in sight. They have no control over these countries anymore, at least in terms of how they did previously. But those countries don't get richer. They get a lot poorer. And that's a tragedy and something people didn't foresee. people assumed once they got independence, they would get more stable and more prosperous, and they didn't for many different reasons. But here's the good news. Starting at around 1990, the trend is quite positive. Sub-Saharan Africa has been getting richer. So that's the good news. But in the short term, it was very disillusioning for a lot of people. A lot of people were looking around saying, man, maybe the British weren't that bad, right? Despite the artificiality of Africa's boundaries, for reasons we covered earlier, all these borders were drawn by Europeans for divide and conquer. And the chronic impracticality of such nations, African governments were terrified of secession and eschewed any suggestions of altering borders. A lot of big words there. They looked at what happened in India and said, no thanks. As chaotic as these borders are in Africa, for example, we need to keep them because the alternative could be even worse. The OAU, Organization of African Unity, was thinking about this, and they were very clear, and they wrote in the charter to open up boundaries for negotiation. If we start changing the borders that the Europeans drew, as bad as those borders are, if we start, for example, adjusting them according to ethnicity, would invite a bloodbath. It would be like what happened in India times 10. That was the fear. Increasingly, professional armies of colonial heritage found themselves challenged by well-armed guerrilla forces, the latter purporting to represent the oppressed masses. If you remember earlier, in an earlier unit, we talked about divide and conquer, and one of the things the Europeans did was put minority groups in charge of the military. And I hope you remember their logic behind that, right? You take a minority group that wouldn't normally have much power, and the empire would say to them, hey, you can control the military, your kids go to the best schools, you all get BMWs, and in return, you keep control of the majority for us, for the empire. Well, you can probably imagine that after independence, the majority groups really resented those minority groups who had collaborated with the Europeans. They thought they were sellouts. They thought they were traitors. You should understand that point of view. And that led to civil wars of guerrilla forces. We talked about guerrilla warfare earlier. Guerrilla forces representing, in their minds, the oppressed masses, the people that had suffered under colonialism, and they're trying to overthrow governments if those governments are dominated by minority groups that helped the empire. So again, the after effects of this divide and conquer are not over. Now, this raises the question, the last thing we'll talk about here. Here you have a image of what is probably a child soldier somewhere in sub-Saharan Africa. And where's he get the AK-47? Where do the weapons come from? Let's look at some data. The blue countries are arms exporters. So you can see the flow on the map there, right? The Europeans, the Chinese, the Russians, the Americans, the British are flooding the rest of the world with weapons. On the left-hand column, arms exports. Who is selling the most weapons? Well, we are number one, of course, USA. We sell more weapons all throughout the world than anyone else by a lot. Most of our weapons go to North Africa and the Middle East. How's that working out? Are those stable places? The British, also a lot of weapons to North Africa and the Middle East. The French, same thing. Russia sends most of its weapons to Asia, as does China. And China sends huge amounts of weapons to Africa, if you notice there. Who's importing the weapons? All the red countries. Latin America gets most of its weapons from us. Africa gets most of its weapons from Russia. Asia gets most of its weapons from us, as does North Africa and the Middle East. But the flow is clear here. Now, there's a couple things I want to point out. There's a lot of truth to the fact that it's the former empires that are flooding their former colonies with these weapons. The British and the French sending weapons into Africa when they had previously controlled all of Africa. That says something. I would also like to point out the top arms exporters: USA, UK, France, Russia, China. That's literally the United Nations Security Council. The United Nations Security Council has 5 countries. And those 5 countries on the United Nations Security Council are the 5 countries that are flooding the rest of the planet with weapons. So that's interesting. And just, think about the morality of this, right? Should we be flooding the rest of the world with weapons? The idealistic view would be no, that causes chaos. The kind of more, I don't want to say Machiavellian again, but the more realistic, or, I guess the proponents would claim to be more realistic, would say, look, the world's a dangerous place. There's bad guys everywhere. And we need to pick sides and make sure that the good guys don't get slaughtered by the bad guys. So we need to send weapons to whoever we feel like we need to. So, for example, if China, our adversary, is sending weapons to some rebel group in Africa, our government will almost always respond by sending weapons to whoever that rebel group is fighting against, because we say, if the Chinese are arming these people, they must be the bad guys, so we're going to arm the other side. And so all of the former colonies of the empires are unstable, chaotic, varying degrees of civil war and unrest. And part of what drives that violence is these countries in blue flooding the global south with all of these weapons. All right, so that wraps up this unit. There is only one unit left, the collapse of communism. And I will see you then.